In this first module, we're going to set the stage for what is to come by first introducing this notion of a financial sector, within which, of course, financial markets are key components, and then deal with this idea of financial disintermediation, the fact that financial sectors have experienced over time a shift away from financial intermediaries, mostly commercial banks, but other financial institutions, onto capital markets. And then we will explain why, in fact, this shift is important in fostering economic growth. So, starting with the financial sector. Financial sector is just one of the sectors that make up our economy. The traditional breakdown of a given economy in sectors is simply primary sector would be mining and agriculture, fisheries. Secondary sector would be about manufacturing, and the tertiary sector would be about services, within which, of course, financial services are a significant component. Now, within that financial sector, we're going to find as key players financial intermediaries, commercial banks, obviously, but also a whole slew of institutions which play a very similar role to what commercial banks do, although not necessarily known as such. Leasing companies, finance companies, brokerage firms, investment banks, asset managers, which include, of course, mutual funds, but also private equity firms, hedge funds, and others, and last but not least, insurance companies. Financial intermediaries, of course, are not the only constituents of the financial sector. First, they compete, as we will explain in greater detail with capital markets, but they're also regulated by a number of agencies and overseen by the central bank. Now, question about the financial sector is, what are the functions that the financial sector perform in our economy? And here is a series of very important tasks that a well-functioning financial sector provide to our economy. Starting with the obvious, which is facilitating payments, clearing and settling payments to enable the exchange of goods, services, and of course assets when it comes to financial markets. Second, this idea of pooling savings to enable large-scale economic activities. As you think of households, individuals accumulating savings, that by itself is never enough to really develop or promote a economic enterprise. So the pooling of savings is a key factor in what the financial sector perform. Transferring resources through time and across geography. This is really this notion of granting credit, financial intermediation, which we're going to return to in greater detail in a few moments. Fourth, managing risks. This notion that the financial sector, by providing various products, mostly financial derivatives, contracts of various kinds, foster an efficient division of labor among market participants to allow not so much for the elimination of risk as much as the transfer of risk from participants, institutions which are relatively ill-equipped to bear risk to those which are better equipped to bear risk. And I think this is an important point. Very often we think about risk management as the elimination of risk. this notion that you can enter into a forward contract and lock in the price of copper or the price of a currency for delivery at a future point in time. Yes, to a point, but effectively what you're doing is transferring risk from one party to the next. And those contracts are facilitated that transfer. They are not eliminating risk. And if managing risk is efficient, the transfer is going to occur between somebody or an agency or an institution or a firm which is not that well equipped to bear that particular risk, whether it's foreign exchange risk, whether it's credit risk, whether it's commodity price risk, to a firm or an entity which is better equipped because maybe it has a larger balance sheet, maybe because it has a distribution of its activities that equip that institutions to handle risk more effectively. Last but not least, providing information both before investment is undertaken and once it is operating, which optimize allocation of resources. Very important idea when we're looking at the financial sector. Financial sector that functions well is a financial sector that allocate resources where they should be allocated. What in corporate finance we refer to as value creation. This is a very powerful algorithm, if you will. A financial sector that does not function well will send money, financial resources to the wrong destination. And that's what we know as crisis, financial crisis, such as the Asian financial crisis or the subprime financial crisis, which we'll have a chance to come back to. Now, we talk about financial sector. I just want to emphasize why developing one country's financial sector is important. We all know that developing a financial sector will boost economic growth through accumulating savings by creating jobs and so on and so forth. What leaves us somewhat perplexed is this idea that if looking at world economies, we find that countries which tend to have a relatively larger financial sector vis-a-vis the economy at large. If you think of a ratio of the size of your financial sector to a country's GDP, you find that these are the countries which also happen to be the richest, to have the highest GDP per capita. Switzerland, Singapore, UK, and so on and so forth. These are countries that have a relatively large financial sector as compared to the GDP, and they tend to be better off. So the question is it because the financial sector is relatively larger that they are richer, or is it because they're richer that they have a bigger financial sector? And I think the consensus is that the causality really runs from a stronger financial sector boosting the economic growth and making countries' household better off. So what we're going to discuss in this course, which is focused on developing capital markets, is of course a very key component to this process of developing a country's financial sector.